certain and which we have found now is the missing link, Tarseti. In 1962, an American team on the Keith Seal discovered a pharaonic dynasty south of Egypt which had all the major markings of the pharaonic dynasties. There they found the palace facades and the palace erects. There they found the falcon god Horus, the son of God. Among the Egyptians, the Christ, the first Christ figure. And there they found the crown of the south, unmistakable shape of the crown of the south, and the heads of a dozen black pharaohs, even before Aha or Narmer-Menes or whoever, Scorpion or whoever was the first in Egypt. And there they found the beginnings of the hieroglyphs. In other words, there was now no question that the Nubian was not merely in the evening, he was in the dawn. And it took them 16 years before they announced this. They said it took them 16 years to put the pieces together. But there were some of those pieces, like a stone incense burner from Nubia, that didn't need putting together. It wasn't even broken. But the man in charge of that expedition, Keith Seal, sat on it until he died. And after he died, thank God for his passing at that stage, because were it not for that, we would not have even heard of it. There emerged from the back rooms of the museums things which had been pushed aside, and the whole new picture emerged. And then came people, this could not be true. Lost Pharaohs of Nubia, Bruce Williams, it could not possibly be true. And there were attacks on Bruce Williams, and he replied brilliantly. If you read the papers, not only the lost pharaohs of Nubia, but the attack that was made and the brilliant defense point by point, you will know why this is so important. At UNESCO, Gamal Abdul Mokhtar, head of the project, when I asked him, I said, "Sir, I need Diop's paper, Origin of the Egyptians, to publish in the Journal of African Civilization." He said, "I will give you permission, Van Sertima, but you have to publish a disclaimer saying that we didn't all agree to it." This is the Egyptian, you know. Doesn't want to be called black. No, sir. Because the black figure had suffered a tremendous loss of status in the world. We had been turned slaves. So that when Count Volney, even in that late stage, walked among them, and they had already become mixed with many peoples, he said, "It is clear to me that this is a Negro race, and that we owe so much of our arts and sciences to these people we have made our slaves, the objects of our contempt." He was troubled by that guilt. And there were so many who went there with fixed ideas, like the man who wrote, Budge, who wrote the Egyptian dictionary, at first thinking they were Caucasoids or Afro-Asiatic, and when he started to write his dictionary, he began to realize all the roots of these things lie in Africa. And Gerald Massey saw that. And you look at the language, Kenti means south. And do you know what it also means? It means first. Those people south of them were first. And they created one of the names for Africa. Africa came through many names. Sometimes they were called Ethiopians and Libyans and all sorts of things. But there is a name that is in Egyptian, Afro-Ika. It was not for the continent, but it was for the people south of them. Afro-Ika meaning beginnings. And they call their people Kemiu, the dark people, the black people, Kemet, the black land. And they said the reason why it was calling it the black land is because the earth is black. I don't know what they're talking about. Everything had to be turned upside down to make it correct. The black does not fit here.
In the burning sands of northern Africa, beneath a hot desert sun, a powerful kingdom thrived for thousands of years. Strong kings and queens built massive temples and buried their dead in pyramid-shaped tombs. But this is not Egypt, and the people who made these monuments were not ancient Egyptians. This is the Sudan, the largest country in Africa and the birthplace of Nubia, a golden kingdom nourished by the Nile.
At that time, it was the largest country of the whole world. It was an empire, a real empire.
An empire with a language that scholars still can't read.
Of the great religious complex they built here.
Most of what we actually see on the site at the foot of Jebel Barkal today dates from a later period. But beneath these later temples, there were earlier Egyptian temples. The fact that there was a large fortress here, I mean, one would expect to be able to find these Egyptian fortresses, absolutely massive structures, but we've neither found remains of the town, of the fortress, or of the associated cemeteries.
But one thing is clear. Jebel Barkal was now the southern home of the supreme god Amun, and whoever ruled here had a divine right to rule both Kush and Egypt.
People ask us, why are we so angry about this thing? Why are we so worked up about it? What does it matter? It happened thousands of years ago. Why does it matter? And the question arises, why does it matter to them? Because at UNESCO, when Diop went further, and he went between the derm and the epiderm, and he established through the melanin dosage test that the level of melanin, the density of melanin in the skin of the mummies was so great that it could not be leucoderm but melanoderm types, no caucasoids. And then Abdullah, the Egyptian delegate, Abdullah, the Egyptian delegate, jumped up and said, even if they're black-skinned, they're white. They're just darkened by the sun. It's very hot out there, by the way. Do you know why it is important? Because the Egyptian, the modern Egyptian, is not an Egyptian. When the Egyptian Minister of Culture jumps up in the newspapers, I've seen it in some Dallas newspaper, the Egyptian Minister of Culture talking about my culture, my foot. It has nothing to do with him. The Arabs came into Egypt in 638 AD, thousands of years after the Pyramid Age.
In 1974, Fred Wendorf and his team were driving back to Abu Simbel from deep into the desert and stopped at this spot, which eventually was called Nabta Playa, to have what they call a comfort break. They wouldn't have a pee. And they very quickly realized that all around them were these strange, a lot of potsherds, a lot of tools, stone tools lying about, and particularly strange stones that seemed to be put in conglomeration. They very quickly realized that this was a prehistoric site, and got permission to do research there, and they set up a team called the Combined Prehistoric Expedition. They joined forces with the Polish Academy of Science, led by a fellow called Romuald Shield. And there they were, studying this site. It took them a while, strangely enough, I mean, one of the things they realized very quickly was that it wasn't a settlement. It wasn't a place where people lived. It was what they eventually called a ceremonial site. It was a place where people gathered to perform rituals, a bit like Stonehenge in England. In fact, one of the artifacts at Nabta Playa is a rather intriguing stone circle, which has been dubbed the mini Stonehenge of the desert. It's not nowhere near as large as Stonehenge, but it has the same characteristics. It's a circle having astronomical alignments. It took a long time for them to realize that this site was not just a ceremonial site, but it was more specifically a ceremonial site with a strong astronomical input. This they realized in 1996 or 97 when they invited an astronomer from Boulder, Colorado, Professor Kim Malville, who very quickly realized that what he was looking at was alignments towards the various stations of the sun, and later discovered that there was a lot of stellar alignments. To cut a long story short, I mean, they eventually published very conservatively a letter in the science journal Nature, which caused a sensation because they declared that they had found the oldest astronomical calendar in the world, predating Stonehenge by several thousand years. That is the importance of Nabta Playa, not just its antiquity, but because it is the oldest site that we know in the world where ancient people performed astronomical observations. What was even more intriguing about Nabta Playa was that there were stellar alignments. There were long lines of stones heading towards the eastern horizon and the northern horizon. And the surprise came when when Kim Malville worked out that these alignments were aiming at the very constellations that the pyramid builders many thousand years later used, particularly Orion's belt, particularly the star Sirius, and in the north, particularly the Big Dipper. Gives us a variety of dates. We have been able to detect that people came to Nabta Playa about 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. Now that puts the presence of these people in that area at least 6,000 to 7,000 years before the pyramid builders. That's the kind of difference we're talking about, the time scale. We know that not only they settled in Nabta Playa perhaps around the 6th or 7th millennium BC, but that they stayed there for several thousand years. They suddenly disappear around 3,500 BC. And here is the interesting part, is that when they disappear, the pharaonic civilization emerges. And, it doesn't take a rocket engineer to realize that these people must have gone. The reason they disappeared is that the area became impossible to sustain life. The desert became super arid. There was no more rainfalls. The wells had dried up. And they were literally forced to move. And the logical place for them to go was towards the Nile. And therefore, it doesn't come as a surprise at all that the pharaonic civilization begins in the distant south, adjacent to Nabta Playa. We're not the only people saying this, by the way. I mean, most anthropologists today are of this conclusion. And Egyptologists are slowly coming around now to the very strong possibility that the pharaonic civilization owes its origins to this black African people that lived in the Sahara for thousands of years. And there is no doubt at all that they themselves, these prehistoric people, had come from Central Africa.